Hello, everyone. This is the second lecture. Last time we spoke about the historical foundations that led up to the creation of this country. We talked about the Magna Carta and some of the other documents that our founders studied when they decided to put together a new country, a different form of government than they have been used to. What I'm going to do tonight is kind of give you an overview of some of the founders. This should probably take, I think, about an hour. And then in the next lecture, we will actually begin looking at the Constitution itself and go through the various elements of the Constitution. The Constitution isn't terribly long. Uh, it's actually you could sit down and read it in less than 15 minutes. It's not a huge document, and its simplicity is perhaps one of its benefits. But let's talk about um, the founders. And in doing this, this will help us to understand what their thought process was, and um, ultimately will help us to understand a little bit better what's going on in the Constitution when we get to talk about the Constitution. So first, George Washington. George Washington lived from 1732 until 1799. He was, as you know, the first president. He was, of course, a British subject, and he was in the colonial army at the age of 22. He fought in the French and Indian War, which it sounds like well, let me explain what the French and Indian War was. It's the French were the historical enemies of the British, and what they did was they got together with the Indians and hoped that by joining forces with them, that they together could defeat the British and kick them out of North America. It did not work out that way for them. The British ultimately defeated the French and later the Indians. Uh, but George Washington served in the colonial army, and that's where he learned his military training, which ultimately served him well when he uh, was the leader of the revolutionary forces following 1776. Washington was a strong man, well over 6 feet tall, which was large for that time period. He was a commanding presence. He had light brown hair, grayish blue eyes, and a somber, serious demeanor. Uh, he commanded respect by his sheer physical size and strength, but also through the force of his personality. Uh, by the age of 57, however, he had lost all of his teeth. And so he had a set of teeth made for him by the famous silversmith, Paul Revere. Uh, There are some myths about George Washington that I want to discuss. One of them is the story about George Washington and the cherry tree. The story is that as a young man, a very young man, his father gave him a hatchet as a birthday gift. And wanting to try out the hatchet, he went out into the yard and chopped down one of his father's cherry trees. And when his father came home, he was quite upset to find one of his cherry trees laying in the yard. And he approached George, the young George, and asked him to tell him the truth. Did you chop down my cherry tree? And George Washington is purported to have said, "Father, I cannot tell a lie. I did chop down your cherry tree." Um, that is probably never happened. The thing is, when George Washington died, he died in 1799, just 2 years after his last term in office. And there was a great love for George Washington and a desire to learn more about him. And there was a gentleman whose name was Parson Weems, who was the first biographer of George Washington. And they didn't really know much about his life as a child because who knew that this young man was going to grow up to be the famous George Washington? So, in fact, they've only just recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, discovered the location of the house where he probably grew up. So we don't really know very much at all about his life as a child, and we certainly It's certainly unlikely that he chopped down a cherry tree and then confessed the truth to his father. We don't know that that happened at all. The story is just designed to reflect that George Washington apparently was always an honorable and honest man. Uh, I mentioned that he had lost all of his teeth, and he had a set of dentures made for him by he had several sets of dentures actually, and at the time, they made there. One of the rumors, the myths about George Washington is that he had teeth made out of wood, which is absolutely not true. The truth is that his George Washington's teeth are uh, in the possession of the Smithsonian Museum, and if you're ever fortunate enough to be there at the right time, they may have his teeth, a set of his teeth on display. They are not made out of wood. They're made out of bone and ivory, and uh, sometimes they made teeth out of a set of dentures out of human teeth. One of the stories is that George Washington may have purchased some of his teeth from his own slaves. That is most likely true. Uh, Washington owned over 100 slaves at the time of his death, and he freed those slaves in his will. But being from Virginia, Virginia was, as we know, one of the longest slaveholding states in the country. So it was not unusual for him to have to own slaves. The thing about George Washington and why he is so revered is this: when he was the leader of the Revolutionary Army, and ultimately we won following the siege at Yorktown. Um, Historically, the person who is in charge of the military at the end of the revolution out to be the person who leads the country then. But instead of doing that, George Washington took off his uniform and went home. Uh, so people respected him for doing that. That instead of grasping for power, he walked away from power. It could be that George Washington knew very well that the form of government that existed at the time was not going to work out. It could also be that he just wanted to go home. But the fact is, when he was ultimately selected to be president, he was chosen universally. There was no debate that George Washington should be the first president when he did, in fact, become the first president. His vice president and the second founder that we're going to talk about, John Adams. John Adams lived from 1735 until 1826. A short, rotund fellow. He was the cousin of Samuel Adams, who is a brewer. Some of you may be familiar with Samuel Adams products. He was a fourth generation resident of Massachusetts, and he was a practicing attorney. When we talk about George Washington, the only education that he had was some schooling, and he was a surveyor, which served him well when he was in the military, because as a surveyor, you traveled a lot through the countryside. Um, but Washington surrounded himself with intelligent people when he became president, and John Adams was one of those people that he chose. Uh, John Adams became famous in representing the 6 British soldiers who shot and killed some of the citizens during the Boston Massacre of 1770. He won the case, which was quite unusual because uh, at the time of the Boston Massacre, the British soldiers were not in high favor among the citizens of Boston, and his willingness, John Adams' willingness to publicly represent people that had shot and killed people, the Bostonian citizens, um, won him great acclaim. The fact that he took on this uh, unpopular task. He, in fact, sent his family out of town during the trial because there were death threats against his family. The fact that he took on this unpopular uh, task and did so well at it that he, to everyone's surprise, succeeded in gaining acquittals for the 4 men that he actually represented. His defense was self-defense. What we know about the Boston Massacre is that it started out in a pub, as a lot of these things do. People were drinking in the pub, and they came out, and there was soldiers guarding an armory near the pub, and they began taunting the soldiers and throwing things at them. Ultimately, first it was snowballs, but then it was rocks and bricks that they were throwing at the soldiers. And of course, the soldiers called for backup. Ultimately, there was a crowd of people yelling and throwing things at the soldiers and saying stupid things like "Fire, damn you! Why don't you fire?" And eventually, the soldiers did. One of the questions at trial was who gave the order to the soldiers to fire, and it was never clearly established who was the leader that actually ordered the men to fire. And it could be that they simply misheard the crowd and took it as an order. John Adams claimed that they acted in self-defense was sufficient, and the people that he represented were found not guilty. There's also the Boston Tea Party that John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams were likely responsible for. The actual people that boarded the ship and threw the tea overboard, we don't really know who they were, because all of them were disguised, and so they deliberately chose not to reveal who they were. But they dressed up as Native Americans, and they threw a considerable quantity of tea overboard. We'll probably come back to this later and talk in a little bit more detail about the Boston Tea Party. And if you hang on just a second, because I want to pull up something. Which I'm going to use in just a minute. All right. Now, John Adams, as I said, was the vice president, and he only served one term, and he was not a very popular president, most likely because he allowed the Alien and Sedition Acts to take effect. He signed them into law. The Alien Act is still part of our immigration law, and that really wasn't the issue that shortened his time as president. It was the Sedition Acts that shortened his time as president. The Sedition Act made it possible for the federal government to arrest anyone who criticized or said bad things about the president. And John Adams was a member of the Federalist Party, which was one of the early political parties. And perhaps it should not surprise you that the only people that ever got arrested under the Sedition Act were members of the opposing party. No Federalist was ever charged under that act. Eventually, the Sedition Act was allowed to expire. And as I said, it's probably the Sedition Act that resulted in John Adams being only serving one term as president. George Washington served 2 terms, as I'm sure you know, and the rule, there was no rule about how many terms you could serve. People generally only served 2 terms because that was the standard that was set by George Washington. And in fact, it remained the standard until the time of World War II, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt wound up serving 4 terms in office. He died in office, but we'll get to that later when we talk about the Constitution. The next founder that I want to talk about is Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson lived from 1743 until 1826. He was a lawyer from Virginia, and he served as George Washington's Secretary of State. He was nearly as tall as Washington, but I think some people would refer to him as a ginger. He had red hair. He was the 3rd president of the United States. And Jefferson was a strong believer in maintaining a weak federal government. He thought that most of the power should remain with the states. And that was one of the big issues of the day. Where should most of the power be? Should it be that the federal government has great authority over the states, or should the federal government have very little authority over the states? Jefferson took that view. Uh, the federal government should only be responsible for protecting us from foreign invasion, and that's about it. Jefferson, as I said, practiced law, and he served in the Virginia House of Burgesses before the Revolutionary War. He was, of course, the author of the Declaration of Independence. He was a slaveholder. He owned several hundred slaves, and they were necessary, he felt, to maintain his 5,000-acre estate. He wrestled with the idea of what to do about slavery. It is a great inconsistency that the person who penned the lines that all men are created equal should at the same time own slaves. And he did not know how to resolve the problems of slavery. He felt that he wrote that if the slaves were freed, there was a great possibility that many of them would turn against their former masters and descend into violence. He considered the possibility of creating a new colony in Africa and sending the freed slaves back to Africa. But when you look at it from a realistic perspective, that just wasn't likely going to work, because the slaves that lived here many of them had been here for generations. And so sending them back to Africa would be akin to sending somebody to Mars. There would be nothing for them to do there, and they would be totally unprepared for the environment. Thomas Jefferson was a deep thinker. As president, he did accomplish many great things. The greatest, perhaps, is the Louisiana Purchase, which makes up about a third the size of the present United States. He ran for president in 1800, and that election of 1800 showed up one of the great flaws of the early Constitution. It's difficult for us to imagine this now, but what they thought at the time when they set up the original Constitution was that the president should probably be somebody that was not actively seeking for power. And the way they were going to do this was, we will talk about the Electoral College in one of the later lectures, but the way that they did it was they set up an Electoral College that would cast the votes for the president. And whoever got the most votes from the Electoral College would be the president. And whoever got the next most votes from the Electoral College would be the vice president. Well, we don't do that now because when Thomas Jefferson ran for president, there was a tie in the Electoral College. And it went, as you might know if you've studied the Constitution at all, if there is a tie in the Electoral College, it goes to the House of Representatives, and they're supposed to vote to break the tie. The House of Representatives is the people's house. We elect the House of Representatives. So this tie, it was a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, whose name you might remember from history. It went to the House of Representatives, as the Constitution required that it do, and the House of Representatives voted, and it was a tie in the House of Representatives. Well, the Constitution doesn't tell us what to do if there's a tie in the House. So instead, what they did was they debated and argued about it, and they voted, and again, it was a tie. And they debated and argued about it and voted again, and again, it was a tie. So this was a great embarrassment for the young United States, that we were attempting to do things the way our Constitution required, and we were stuck without a president. What ultimately happened, though, is Alexander Hamilton, who was a member of the Federalist Party, who was and not the same party as Thomas Jefferson, actually spoke up, crossed the aisle in favor of Jefferson. He said, I know Aaron Burr. He practices law in New York State, as do I. And I know him. I know Thomas Jefferson. And this I can say, that Thomas Jefferson at least is an honest man. Well, following that declaration by Alexander Hamilton, that broke the tie in the House, and Thomas Jefferson ultimately became the third president of the United States, and he served in that office for 2 terms. 2 years later, Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel and shot and killed him. It's unlikely that his interference with the Thomas Jefferson election directly resulted in that duel, because it was 2 years later after all, but it certainly could not have helped. The early development of our government is characterized by Hamiltonian views versus Jeffersonian views. Hamilton, a member of the Federalist Party, as I said a minute ago, the Federalist Party wanted the federal government to have more power, and that was Jefferson's. That was the opposite of Jefferson's view. Jefferson thought that most the power should remain with the local states. Alexander Hamilton is the next founder that we're going to speak about, and he lived from, before I leave Thomas Jefferson, there is an oddity about Thomas Jefferson, and that is that during the Revolution and the lead up to the break from England, he and John Adams were great friends, and they worked together very well during the Revolution. After the Revolution ended and we prevailed and a new government was set up, they broke ranks from each other and actually became very critical of each other. But they both died in the same year, 1826, and in fact they both died on the same day, July 4th of 1826, which is one of the great historical coincidences. After both of them left political office, they eventually reconciled and became good friends once again. So anyway, this leads us to Alexander Hamilton, who is the next in our list of founders that I want to discuss. John Adams had a very low view of Alexander Hamilton. He felt that only certain people should be in position of leadership. There are people who are born to be a leader, and everyone else should just be followers. And he actually felt that it was a matter of being well born, who your family is, and what education that you had. The well-bred, well-born should lead. That was John Adams' view. That's not the view that we hold today, of course. And Alexander Hamilton certainly would not have held that view because of where he came from. Alexander Hamilton was born in 1755 and he died in 1804 at the hands of Aaron Burr. Hamilton was once described by John Adams as the bastard son of a Scotch peddler, which tells you in a line everything that he thought about Alexander Hamilton. And it's absolutely true that he was the bastard son of a Scotch peddler. His mother and her husband moved to the British East Indies, and in fact, I can show you where Alexander Hamilton, where he was born. This is the island of Nevis. And Alexander Hamilton was born in the area of Charlestown. This was a British island. And if we zoom out, you can see where this island is. It's in the middle of nowhere. That place there is where Alexander Hamilton was born. And so his mother and her husband moved there thinking that they could make a living on the island there. Her husband eventually left and went back to Scotland. And the mother, Alexander Hamilton's mother, having no support, no husband anymore, and there was no possibility of divorce, she took up with another man, and this was the father of Alexander Hamilton. The husband, that abandoned her was not his father. And the Alexander Hamilton's father, after Alexander and his brother were born, also abandoned Rachel, Alexander's mother, and eventually poor Rachel died of a fever and left a young Alexander Hamilton to fend for himself. Ultimately, what happened is that a hurricane struck the area. And there's a little bit more that I have to tell before I talk about the hurricane. Alexander Hamilton was uh, taken care of by relatives, and there was a shipping agency in the Isle of Nevis that he went to work for them, and he was so effective and efficient with numbers and bookkeeping that the owners of the company felt it was they allowed him to run things while they were off conducting other business. And eventually, a hurricane blew through the area, the British East Indies, and Alexander Hamilton wrote an account of the effects of the hurricane, and the publication of that letter was so well received by the citizens on the island that they got together um, a fund to send Alexander Hamilton to college, and they got enough money together to send him to New York City, where he attended college, and ultimately it was while he was in law school that the revolution broke out. Hamilton somehow managed to get into retinue, George Washington's retinue, and he actually became very close with George Washington. He was the son that George Washington never had. When Washington became president, he set up Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury because of his strong business knowledge and skill. He was the person who set up the Treasury Department. As a member, as the leader of the Treasury Department, he set up the first Coast Guard. You may or may not know that one of the functions of the Coast Guard is to stop smuggling. And in the early United States, that's imports of goods was one of the ways that people made money in the new United States. And so Hamilton, being well versed in the notion of how to make money, set up the Coast Guard to intercept smugglers. He also had a notion about a national bank. Now the idea of a national bank came to him out of a couple of things. One of them is that there needs to be, he felt, a way for the federal government to handle money and taxation, and a bank is certainly one of those things that would do that. It would handle money and taxation, collecting taxes. He also felt, though, there was um, many of the soldiers that fought during the Revolutionary War uh, were not paid, and they were still owed their money. And each of the colonies uh, created their own um, armies of sorts and sent them to George Washington. But they were supposed to be paid by their states. The states were responsible for paying for their own soldiers. After the revolution, after we won the revolution, some of the states were fairly well off and were able to pay off their soldiers, but not everyone. And there were a number of soldiers, lots of them, in fact, that had never been paid by their representative states. And Alexander Hamilton, remember, he wants the federal government to be more powerful. And so he came up with this notion that the federal government should pay off what was owed to those soldiers because um, first of all, it was the right thing to do, but secondly, if you are owed money for your efforts as a Revolutionary War veteran, and your own state is not paying you, and the federal government comes forward and pays you, who are you going to love now? Well, that's right. It would certainly make the people much more fond of their federal government if the war debt was paid. And that was one of the ideas that Hamilton had, was to set up a national bank. Um, but he had difficulty in doing it because as Secretary of the Treasury, he didn't have direct access to Congress, and Congress would have to pass legislation to set up the bank. And Hamilton was sitting in outside of his office one day, appearing quite dejected, and Thomas Jefferson happened by, and of course they were not great friends, but Jefferson struck up a conversation with him and asked him what was he so sad about, and Hamilton replied that he didn't have the votes to get his national bank off the ground, and Jefferson saw an opportunity. He wanted um, the new nation's government to be closer to Virginia, where Jefferson came from. You may not be aware of this, but when George Washington served as president, his first term, he served in New York City. Washington D.C. had not been created yet. His second term was in Philadelphia, and so there was, even though people disagreed over where the new seat of government should be, there was a strong argument that either one of those cities should be the seat of government, either New York City or Philadelphia. Thomas Jefferson wanted it to be close to Virginia, and so what he suggested to Hamilton is, come to my house for dinner, and I'll get Madison, who is in Congress, and we'll work something out. Well, there was a meeting, a dinner. What exactly was said, or what happened during that dinner, what deals were made or promised, we don't know. What we do know is that following the dinner, Alexander Hamilton was able to create his national bank, and Thomas Jefferson got what he wanted, which is Washington, D.C. was ultimately set up in an enclave that is very, very near to Virginia. Part of the reason why he wanted the national bank, Alexander Hamilton said, was he felt that a national debt would be a national blessing. Now, this is an odd thing to consider. Why would he say that a national debt would be a national blessing? Well, it comes down to a country's credit rating. You might be aware that every country has a credit rating. Companies like Standard and Poor's rate each nation according to their credit worthiness. And how do you establish a credit rating? Well, as you probably know, you get somebody to loan you money. You either go out and get a credit card, or you borrow money in some way from a bank, credit union, and you show that you are good at paying and you pay on time. If you do that, then you will establish a credit rating. Countries have credit ratings, and that also needs to be developed. In order to have a good credit rating, you have to show that you can borrow money and pay it back. And a credit rating is important because countries frequently borrow from each other for the various projects that they have in mind. So yes, the national bank did in fact become a thing. We will come back and talk about the national bank in a later lecture when we talk about federalism, because that was a big part of the rise in power of the federal government, was the creation of this national bank. Our next founder that we're going to talk about is James Madison. Madison is important. He is known as the father of the Constitution, or sometimes the architect of the Constitution. And he lived from 1751 until 1836. He was present during the Constitutional Convention in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, and he took notes on what happened on a daily basis. And those notes of Madison's are available online if you're interested in researching what did the founders talk about while they were debating how to create this new democracy. James Madison's writings are a primary source for that. He was also responsible for the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which we refer to as the Bill of Rights. We'll come back to that issue of the Bill of Rights pretty soon, because when we talk about the Constitution and the ratification of the Constitution, the presence of the Bill of Rights was a critical feature that led to the ratification of the Constitution. Like Jefferson, Madison was an anti-federalist. Thomas Jefferson's political party was, don't get confused about this now, it was referred to as the Democratic Republicans. They are not at all related to the present of Democrats or Republican parties, because the issues that they dealt with at the time are radically different from what we deal with now. They were more focused on the issue of where should the power of the new government fall? Should it remain with the states, or should the new federal government be, all powerful? Madison was an anti-federalist. He was not a very tall man. He was about 5'1". His friends referred to him as Jemmy, but he was Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State, and when we refer to when we talk about federalism, we'll talk about a case called Marbury versus Madison, and it's James Madison that lawsuit was involving. Madison was the fourth president following Jefferson, and he served as president from 1808 until 1816. He was also the president during well, we'll come back to that later. Finally, we talk about Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was the oldest of the founders. He lived from 1706 until 1790. He made his fortune as a printer. He was fortunate enough to get the contract from the monarchy of England to do most of the printing in the new colonies. And he was a very clever fellow. He developed anti-counterfeiting devices, some of the earliest. And by the time of the Revolution, he was already a rich man. And so he retired and began dabbling in things that at the time, rich men did, science. And Ben Franklin was an inventor. He's responsible for many important inventions. The most important one, I think, is the lightning rod. He experimented with electricity. And there's a myth about Ben Franklin that you probably have already heard, that he flew a kite into a thundercloud, and by touching his finger to a key that was tied to one end of the string, he was able to get a slight shock from that, and demonstrate that lightning was the same thing as electricity. I say that's a myth because when that story was first recorded, it was many years after it allegedly had happened. And the next two people, after the story was published, the next two people who tried that experiment died. So it's very unlikely that Ben Franklin ever flew a kite into a thunderstorm to determine whether lightning is in fact electricity. But his experiments did establish that there was a connection somehow between lightning and electricity, and he concluded that electricity has some of the characteristics of fluid. If you take, for example, a balloon and fill it with water and continue to fill it with water, eventually that balloon will burst and the water will come flooding down in a sudden, splash onto the ground. Lightning, he felt, was the same, that as the lightning built up the electrical charge built up in the sky, eventually it would have to come crashing down to the ground. And what he concluded was, if there was a way to allow the electricity to gradually trickle down to the ground instead of flooding down in a huge bolt of lightning, that we wouldn't have as much lightning. And that was an important thing at the time, because a lightning strike on a building might set the building on fire. And there weren't very effective ways of fighting fire at the time. So when Ben Franklin invented the lightning rod, this made him world famous. He served for a time in both in England as our early ambassador to England. He also served in France. And when he went to France, he showed up dressed in a raccoon skin cap and looking for all the world like a wild man from the wild country of America. And ladies loved him. He also loved the ladies of all the founders. Uh, he was the one that if you were going to go visit him, you should definitely knock on the door before you open it because there was probably a young lady sitting in his lap. When Ben Franklin served as our ambassador to Britain, he had a wife who stayed in Philadelphia. She didn't like the voyage. I mean, boats at that time were very unstable, and they were very uncomfortable. The voyage was very uncomfortable, and it took 30 days at least to get from America to England. So she stayed behind while Franklin went to England. And when Franklin returned from England, he brought a son. So that tells you what you need to know about Ben Franklin. He was on the committee that helped to draft the Declaration of Independence. Certainly Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration, the first draft of the Declaration. But when we look at the Declaration of Independence in the next lecture, we'll talk about some of the things that Ben Franklin's contributions to it. That's my outline of the founders. The break from England really begins with the coronation of King George III of England in 1760. You might say that England's attitude towards the colonies changed as soon as he was crowned. There's another thing that developed also. As a result of the French and Indian War, the French and Indian War is what we call it here in the United States. In Europe, the same war is referred to as the 7 Years' War, and it was a war between France and Britain. At the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, Britain had spent so much money trying to prosecute that war that they were out of money. And they felt that, among other things, that it was time for the American colonies to begin paying England for what they had done. I mean, England had sent soldiers and war material to the colonies to defend the colonies, and so the colonies should pay for that. As a result, they began imposing a series of different taxes on the colonists. And of course, the colonists were very resentful of this. They had been allowed up till now to set their own taxation. And you already know what our slogan was during the Revolution: no taxation without representation. And we get that all the way back from the Magna Carta, which we talked about in the last lecture. The people should be consulted before a tax is imposed. Now, they may not like the tax, they may disagree with the tax, but they should at least have the opportunity to argue against it. Well, England was not going to have that at all. Allowing the colonists a representative in their parliament they were just not going to do that. And so, as I said, a number of different taxes were imposed. There was a tax on sugar. There was a Stamp Act that imposed a tax on documents and papers in 1765. Then we have, of course, the Boston Massacre, which we talked about a minute ago with John Adams. The Boston Tea Party occurred in December of 1773. And in it, 342 crates of tea were tossed into Boston Harbor. I don't know if you've ever been to Boston, but if you've seen the water in Boston Harbor, it's dark and oily and not clean. So there's no question that throwing tea into that water would render it destroyed. I've read different accounts of how much money that tea was worth, ranging from $50,000 up to $800,000 in today's money. But it was clearly a slap in the face to King George. The argument was that the East India Tea Company had a monopoly on the tea that was delivered to the colonies, and there was a tax imposed on that tea, and the tax had been imposed without our consent or without our even being allowed to argue about it. And so that's why the Boston Tea Party occurred, was to we were not even going to allow the tea to be unloaded in America. As a result of the Boston Tea Party, the well, let me explain. The reason why John Adams and his cousin Samuel Adams thought to do this was they wanted to do something outrageous that would really get the king's attention, and they felt that by doing this, they would get the attention of the other colonies. If this happened to Boston, this could easily happen to them, and that's exactly what happened. King George III was outraged, and he imposed a series of new laws that affected Boston. He shut down Boston Harbor first. Secondly, he disbanded the local Massachusetts government and replaced it by British military rule. So so now we've got a lot of soldiers, uh, all housed in Boston. Third, he passed a law that required that certain offenses would be no longer tried in the colonies; they would be tried in England. Now, if you've been charged with, say, smuggling or whatever the crime was, smuggling was certainly one of the big ones that George wanted to be tried in England. Um, if you've been charged with that and you're being tried in England, as I said, it's a 30-day ride to get from America to England by boat. And how are you going to get your witnesses to England? So it's about the same thing as just saying you're not going to have any witnesses on your behalf. So there's that. That was the third act. The fourth was the Quartering Act, which required the new soldiers that were being transported to Boston that they be housed by the people, that people be required to provide housing for the soldiers. So let's take a minute now and take a look at the Declaration of Independence. And give me just a second to pull this up. Now here is a version of the Declaration of Independence that's uh, I just want to go over this very briefly with you. We previously talked about some of the political philosophers. One of them was John Locke, and John Locke was a strong proponent of the idea that we have a so-called a social contract with government, and that when government um, fails to secure the prosperity and happiness of the citizens, that we have the right to alter that government. And we see that kind of philosophy and language in this document. Now, this is one that's you're probably not familiar with the format, but let's pull it up anyway. Uh, so what I want to do is I want to read just a certain portion of this document, the Declaration of Independence, to you. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among them the powers of the earth, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. King George certainly would have laughed at that notion. That they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. I want to come back in a minute and talk about that word, unalienable. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. And so the Declaration then proceeds to discuss a long list of things that King George apparently had done to them. So it's the rest of this document is a list of the reasons why we are throwing off, we're declaring our independence from England. Now let's go back to this word unalienable, because that's not a common term. Unalienable is a legal term, and it really comes from property law. If you owned a piece of property, say that, for example, had a creek running through the property, you could not sell just the creek. You'd have to sell a portion of the property, all of it maybe, and the creek would be a feature of the property. The fact of the creek not being able to be sold separately from the property is referred to as something that is unalienable. If it is unalienable, you cannot sell it separate and apart from the thing. You cannot separate one from the other. So when Thomas Jefferson uses that term, he's using it in the legal sense that these are our unalienable rights, the rights that we carry with us that cannot be taken from us. The Declaration of Independence, of course, it came out in 1776, and it was the fighting had already broken out by that time. There had already been shots fired in the Boston area. But this document sets forth in motion the events that took place afterwards. I'm not going to go over the Revolutionary War. As you know, George Washington was in charge of the army, and he learned and knew very well that the way to win a revolution is not to win every war, but to keep your army alive, to continue pestering and fighting against the opposition. He did a lot of retreating, but ultimately he did, as we know, he did prevail. And so we have at the end of the Revolutionary War a new government, but it is not using the Constitution that we now have. It's a government that operates under what is called the Articles of Confederation. Now, a confederacy, when most people use the term confederacy, they generally think of the Civil War. But the Civil War called itself a confederacy. The Southern states called themselves a confederacy because that was the original form of government that we had when we were starting out as a nation. A confederacy is a loose affiliation of independent states. Under the Articles of Confederation, this is the document that it took effect in 1776, and all through the Revolutionary War, our provisional government was operating under the Articles of Confederation. And there are a number of things to note about the Articles. Remember, this is our first government. It's our first effort at establishing a government. And what the Articles do is this is really Thomas Jefferson's best effort at a new government. All the things that Thomas Jefferson wanted out of a government were present in the Articles of Confederation because all power remained with the states. Under the Articles, I have 8 points that I want to make. First, under the Articles, each state was only entitled to 1 vote, regardless of size or population. So Little Rhode Island could outvote Virginia. because each state had one vote. Every state was independent and had the same power. Number two, uh, under the Articles, there was no power to lay and collect taxes. So the national government had no way to support itself. Uh, George Washington constantly had to fight with the provisional government to help fund the fighting. And instead of, he never did get an effective or funding from the provisional government. What he wound up doing was he would take what he needed as he passed through a neighboring farm, leaving them an IOU. Uh, it was a difficult way to run a war. So no taxation. Three, there was no power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. What was going on was things like this. Uh, After the war, and we're operating under the Articles of Confederation. Let's say that I had some produce, and I'm in Georgia, and I want to sell my produce in another state. Every state that I travel through is going to tax me for the use of their roads. So the states are not pulling together to help each other. They're actually opposing each other, fighting each other for money. Secondly, international trade. Excuse me. Let's say that North Carolina has a harvest of tobacco that they want to sell. And so they load up a ship with tobacco and they take it to, say, Belgium. And the trade minister in Belgium comes out and talks to the representative from North Carolina, and then the discussion goes something like this. I understand that you have tobacco that you'd like to sell. What are you offering? And the representative from North Carolina would respond, well, I have 80 barrels of high-grade North Carolina tobacco. And so the Belgian finance minister says, well, I'm very interested. How much are you wanting? Well, we would like to get $11 per barrel. And the finance minister says, that's very well and good. In the next room, we have South Carolina, and they only want $8 a barrel. So we're going to go with them. Thanks. So there was no uniform way of regulating international trade. And each state was being played against each other by themselves and by the foreign governments. So that's bad. Number four, there was no executive branch. They had no effective executive branch to enforce the acts of Congress. Number five, there was no national court system. So even if they had a way of enforcing the law, there wasn't any court system to do that with. Number six, in order to amend the Articles, it required the consent of every single state to amend it. And number seven, a supermajority, 9 out of the 13 states were required to pass any new laws. So, as I said before, South Carolina, Rhode Island could outvote any of the other states if they chose to. Finally, and this is the oddest thing of all, the terms of the Articles of Confederation simply state that they create a firm league of friendship amongst each other. So this was kind of a laughable point that other countries looking to the new United States might say, well, is this a country or a friendship league? This was the state of things all through the early years of our country. And Alexander Hamilton hated the Articles of Confederation. It was clear that they did not work. He spoke to James Madison, Madison from Virginia, and the two of them agreed that something needed to be done. And so what they did was they agreed to meet in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland. And the purpose of the meeting was to discuss how to improve the Articles of Confederation. Now, at this meeting, the Annapolis meeting, 5 of the 13 colonies showed up. Let me read to you the list of who showed. New Jersey came, New York, Hamilton was from New York, Delaware came, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, Madison being from Virginia. You notice something odd about this list? Nobody from Maryland came. All they had to do was walk across the street to join the meeting, but Maryland did not come. Well, clearly they did not have enough interest in the meeting to proceed. So what the delegates did was they agreed to meet the following year in 1787, and that's what happened. But in the interim, something big developed, and that was Shays' Rebellion. When we pick up with our next lecture, we will begin by talking about Shays' Rebellion. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to our next lecture.